just so we have started. Just so we started this thing, and let's just see where this little conversation takes us. So the first thing that I would like to do is just like give you a chance if you can introduce yourself to our listeners or viewers, watchers, whatever.
Absolutely. So my name is Duncan Geere. I am the co-founder of the Loud Numbers Data Sonification Studio. I work sort of I'm kind of a designer, but I'm an information designer. And that means that I work a lot with data. And I generally sort of help nonprofits tell their data stories. But I like to do that wherever I can with sound through a process called sonification, which is kind of the art and the science of turning data, so like spreadsheets of numbers, into sound and music in all kinds of different ways. And you might be like, what? I've never heard of that. Like, what is that? People who are watching. But you actually have, because if you ever heard of like a Geiger counter, you know, one of those radiation detectors that crackles when you're near radiation, that's an example of sonification. Or like a heart rate monitor in a hospital during an operation that goes beep, beep, beep.
Bad detector.
You've got a bat. Yeah.
Can this work that's as probably a sonification in a way?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, so what does it measure?
Well, basically what it does, it does have like two ultrasonic microphones, and then when the bat moves about, bats do echolocation calls. So they do they do chirp a lot, just so they can know where the prey is and everything. And this is all in ultrasonic range. So what this does, this is a heterodyne bat detector. It basically takes the inputs in, and it has an oscillator inside, and then it translates those inputs into sonification, basically turning the oscillator.
So it pitches it down.
Yeah, it pitches it down in real time. So basically then you can hear how they sound, how they move, and all that. So I'm assuming that could be, since a Geiger counter.
Yeah, I think so. I would call that a kind of subtype of sonification called audification. And like another example of that might be getting like seismic waves from an earthquake and then speeding them up so that they're into the range of human hearing. What you're doing there is like bringing them down into the range of human hearing. And yeah, that's a very common sonification technique. There's also things called audio icons, or earcons, sometimes they're called, which is like sounds that represent an event. So like when you're in the supermarket and it goes beep when it's successfully scanned something, that is that kind of sonification. And then another type of sonification, which is what I tend to do, is called parameter mapping. And I'm sure we'll get into this more. But that's basically when you have numbers within a whole range and you map them onto different audio parameters like pitch or volume or whatever else you want to do.
So, like you stated before, what came first in your life? Like, since you have this unique, I wouldn't say additions, but like unique mixture of numbers, data sets, information, and then at the same time, you do have a love for sound and music. So what came first when in your background and everything like that? What was the initial point that then kind of moved into the other side?
It's very nice of you to call it a unique mix. I would call it a mess. But
each to its own, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these things for a lot of my life have sort of like traveled on separate paths, really. Like my bachelor's degree was in meteorology, which is weather forecasting. And with that, there is a ton of data work that you have to do. You know, you're getting numbers from weather stations all around the world, and you're trying to, from that, figure out what is the weather going to be like tomorrow or a week ahead or 10 days ahead or whatever. But then at the same time as I was studying that, I was also getting super active in student radio, and I was in bands, and I started DJing and things like that. And I'd always also been interested in music. So both of those things were on like parallel trajectories for the vast majority of my life, really. And then about 4 years ago, I started getting interested in data sonification. I just kind of like moved from being a journalist, which was the first part of my career, into working more with data. And I'd come across this thing called data sonification. I don't even remember where I came across it to start with. But I was also a big podcast fan, and I sort of thought, oh, I'd love to listen to a sonification podcast. So I searched and there wasn't one. And I was like, what? Well, how can there not be a sonification podcast? This is such a obvious combination. And I was like, I'll wait a bit and I'll wait for someone to make one. And I waited like a year or so and nobody made one. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to do it then. So yeah, and then I took the idea to my my co-founder in my sonification studio, Miriam Quick, who's also a kind of data journalist. And yeah, I met her at a conference, and she had done a previous sonification project where she had she'd put like breath sensors on her and her partner's chests during sleep to measure the rate of her breathing. And then she turned that into a musical piece. It was called Sleep Songs. I think it was in 2019 or something like that. And yeah, so I talked to her and I was like, do you want to make a podcast together? And she was like, I'll think about it. I was like, oh, okay, probably not then. But then a few days later, she emailed me and she was like, yeah, let's do it. And so, yeah, we started making a podcast. And that's kind of how my interest really in sonification turned from this is something that is kind of interesting to I'm actually going to do this.
So was the podcast in a way kind of like it? I wouldn't say force you, but let's say it motivated you quite a lot. So you basically spend a bit more time digging into this world of sonification and all that, right? But before that,
absolutely,
did you have like interest in audio, interest in sonic art, or anything like that, or musicianship, or anything like that?
Yeah.
So you were
for sure.
Okay. So that's quite amazing, basically. So this is the I mean, the podcast basically pushes you to something else.
It turned me from sort of having this musical part of me that I was it was always been a huge part of me. I've done club nights and I've been in bands and things like that, but it was never sort of associated with the work, storytelling, like data side of me until I discovered that sonification was a thing that existed.
That kind of reminds me, because I do have like this YouTube channel, and this was just something that I wanted to do for years. But it's a little side project, kind of forces you to look into different things that you wouldn't otherwise, because you think, oh yeah, that make a good episode, or that make something else, that made something interesting, and then you just kind of you force yourself into this newer perspectives. But what you stated is that data and stories, which you just mentioned. I always felt like, especially listening to your podcast, that you had like this, there's always like this gigantic story that comes out of data. It's in a way, like a lot of people would just say, oh, it's just numbers. It's just like graphs to kind of move and show you statistics, show you basic scientific data. But with Loud Numbers, which is your podcast, I kind of felt like, oh, there's like so much more human side to it. There's like this thing, and even with data sonification, it's like trying to take art from this side of the land. It's just like trying to create some meaning that come out of data, but like you transcend it in a way. So do you feel like the data is kind of, with sonification, it's kind of breaching a newer ground when it comes to connecting with people, such stories?
Yeah, interesting question. Sort of this I think you're absolutely right that the majority of people think data and they just think spreadsheets of numbers and tables and things like that. If you're lucky, they think about bar charts and stuff like that. But The kind of work that I do is about trying to. So I work a lot with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and usually they are trying to get people to do something differently, and that might be something like, write to your local politician and ask them for more climate action, something like that. It might be talking to politicians directly and saying, hey, this thing that you're doing, it's not a great idea. It would be so much better in the long run if you did this instead, and just being like, here's some numbers, like that kind of engages people on a intellectual level, right? It kind of gives them knowledge. But what I've found is that what drives action, what drives people to actually do things, is to feel something. Like if you feel emotions about the thing, you're so much more likely to act on it than if you're just told, hey, here is a fact, And what I've found is that, visualizations are really good and they're really, really useful, but they are much, much more about informing and not so much about getting people to feel things necessarily. But sound is extremely good at getting people to feel things. Everybody has a favorite song. Everybody has emotional associations with specific pieces of music, whatever culture you are from, anywhere in the world. And I think that being able to, with responsibility, use that kind of like emotional superpower that sound has to kind of tell these data stories can be so much more effective at getting people to change what they do.
That's totally it. When I was listening to Loud Numbers, like I said, it was just like some stories that came out of that just made me think, I wouldn't say in a different way, but it just made me feel far more, especially like there was this episode, I remember, I think it was one of the later episodes that you guys did. It was about the forest fires.
That's our most recent episode. We released that earlier this year. Yeah,
exactly. And especially, it kind of reminded me, by listening just to the, I wouldn't say interview, but the story that the survivor,
Fern.
When she basically spoke about it, kind of reminded me of the whole shabacle that wasn't too long ago with the whole Australian wildfires and then Greece and everything like this. This is something that climate change basically creates. But later going into the part where the music started and you had like this way of chopping it up on certain events and basically really like narrating the story once again through the eyes of the survivor, or I would say through the ears. And it felt like so gushingly emotional at times that it was like just some like because we even get a bit disincentivized because of the constant bad news that we hear, that maybe we only that kind of happened, because it's just like it's facts, it's objective, it's news, it's whatever. But like with this, as soon as you kind of bring an emotional string via music or via sound, it captures,
hits you in a different way.
Yeah, it hits you in a different way, and it's not saying that you made it more important. No, it's the importance is still in the same level. It's just like the way how we experience that is far more, let's say, I wouldn't say manipulative, but you kind of get the idea.
It can be used for manipulation, and we try to be, responsible and not do that. We try to reflect the truth. Miriam and I both have backgrounds as journalists, and so we come at it from that angle. We find something that exists in the world, and we bring that to a larger audience. Now, what we're saying is not lies. It is fact. It's based on data, and I think that when you can bring together data and numbers and facts alongside human stories, you get the best of both worlds, and that can be really, really effective.
Of course. I mean, because we do empathize with certain things.
With people.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Especially when you hear somebody's voice telling you, this is what happened to me.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it can be really effective.
When you hear such stories, right? When you and Miriam make, when you do your research and you reach out to these people and, you hear this side of the stories, even though you go into sonification, which is basically taking the data that was that was recorded there and then transforming this into movable parameters within music and everything, but there's still a bit of I would say a bit of free use when it comes to what type of instruments, what type of sounds you're going to use and everything like that. Do you feel like that those stories that you hear, that you basically discover in a new way, do these influence when you come to picking up the right sounds, so in order to basically capture the message the best way it can, and at the same time you try to be as respectful as possible to...
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is yes. Okay. I mean, maybe it'd be useful just for people who haven't heard the podcast for me to just kind of like describe how it works. Yeah. So in each episode, we sort of introduce a data story. So it might be a town in Alaska that bets on when its river is going to break up each year of ice. And they've been, collecting data from that since 1906. And so, that's an interesting data story. Or it might be a Danish researcher who every summer when he's driving his car to his summer house, he counts how many insects like splatter on the windscreen to track insect population declines. Or it might be, the experience of drinking all kinds of different kinds of beer. Not everything we do is like environmentally focused. We also did one about like the US economy. We've got one about EU bureaucracy over time. That one's a classical fugue. And yeah, so in each one, we sort of like introduce this story and, give you the context for what you're about to hear. And then we explain how the data we've got, we transform that into sound. So we might say, when you hear a sound that sounds like this is a big number. When you hear a sound that sounds like this is a small number. Or, it might be a kind of like, when you hear this sound, this represents this thing happening. And almost all of our tracks are what in the data world we call time series data, which means one of the axes of your chart is time. So, and that works really, really well because music plays out over time. And so it's really, really intuitive for a listener to be like, the thing that happens earlier in the track happened earlier in the time span that we're talking about. And then, so we kind of explain how we turn the data into sound. And then at the end, we play a piece of music that we have created from that data. And this can be in all kinds of different genres. So it might be techno in the case of our climate change track. It might be a classical fugue. It might be a jungle track. It might be a kind of sound art piece. We try to use genre quite carefully to accentuate some of the emotional connections that we want people to draw. So, if it comes to like the US economy, part of our message there is, it's a bit wild and it's kind of, all kinds of crazy stuff can happen.
This is why I use the aim and break. I
right,
suppose,
exactly.
Right.
That's why we went for the jungle, thing on that with, sampling US presidents over the top talking about the economy. It's a weird piece of music if you just look at it as a piece of music. But I think that it gives the, it sort of conveys the emotional feelings that we have about this data in the hope that other people might feel some of those things too.
So because this is then completely personal to your own tastes when it comes to basically, trying to find the different sounds. I remember the beer episode that you guys did. And the use of horns and this bass line and everything like that, it kind of went into a it kind of really made an environment in which the person was there, especially when your guest then started describing the beer tastes and what it is and whatever and everything like that. It was very fun. Yeah.
I mean, that was a fun one to put together. We got a professional a beer taster to basically give us data on the experience of drinking lots of different kinds of beer, and so we made a sort of like micro sonification for each one that reflects the sensory experience, the taste, the smells, the color, all of these things got mapped to different sound parameters. It's probably one of the most complex pieces that we've made because there are so many different mappings. There's bitterness, there's hoppiness, there's sweetness, there's carbonation. And, those are just the tasting parts of it. And with something like that, you do end up doing a really, really long explanation of what everything means. And I think almost everybody who listens to that, by the time they get to the end of the explanation, they've forgotten the beginning. So it's like it's really kind of important that you can listen to it a few times, and podcasts are great for that. But also that you like some of those mappings that we've done are as intuitive as you can kind of do. And so you were asking about sound design before. This is a process that we go through. We sort of say, right, bitterness. Like bitterness in beer, like what does that sound like? And you have to kind of like go through this almost like synesthetic process where you're sort of converting a taste in your head and being like, right, if that was going to sound like something, what would that sound like? And for that one, Miriam was like, right, my association with that is distortion, because it sort of like reminds me of being in pubs and, seeing like, punk bands playing, and they're playing with these distorted guitars, and I'm drinking this bitter beer, and that was her associations that she had, and I was like, great, yeah, let's use that. So the more bitter the piece is, the more distortion you hear on the sound, and so it's just a process of going through some things like that, and then where we can, testing that with other people and just saying, does this make sense to you?
What was like you mentioned the process? What is usually the process when it comes to creating one of these episodes? Like, do you and Miriam just sit down, have a chat, and see, in where the interest lies, or do any of you just find an interesting data set and let's say, oh yeah, that would make a great episode, or I can see the sonification? What's the process?
It usually starts with a data set. Yeah. I mean, Miriam and I collaborate quite a lot. And so we're chatting to each other quite often. And every so often we'll say, oh, I came across this data set. I think it's really interesting. I think this could be an episode. And we then look at the data and make sure that we've got enough there that, that there's an interesting story to tell. It isn't just this thing is going up, ideally it would be something that's got a bit more subtlety to it than that. Though if you have too much up and down in a single sonification, then the person who's listening finds it hard to kind of like detect that signal. Ideally you want maybe something that goes up and then down and then maybe up again. So that's like the kind of like level of
like the economy episode, which I thought, was that it kind of, the whole idea there was like just bumps, ups and downs.
Right, so exactly. So that's what we're conveying there, right? But yeah, with other things, like if you want somebody to, at the end of having listened to it, be able to like draw out the shape of what they were hearing, then you need to have kind of simpler things than you might if you had a bar chart, for example. And you can do that by, taking moving averages of the data. There's some statistical ways in which you can pull those signals out more clearly if you have very noisy data, and I mean statistically noisy, not like sound noisy. It gets sometimes difficult to talk about this stuff because you have the same terminology that means very different things in the two different worlds. But,
yeah, I can imagine. Yes. Yeah. Was there any data set that you thought, wow, this would be really interesting and important, but it would not make a good sonification? Let's say, like you stated before, that if you have just the line going up, it would tell us something that's very important or interesting, but at the same time, it may not make a great art piece. Did anything like that happen when you devised an episode, or when you tried and searched for data set to sonify?
It does happen from time to time. I mean, usually when we're making an episode, we will have our kind of like core story data set. So let's take the example of the climate change one that I was talking about, with the community in Alaska that is placing bets on when the ice is going to break up each year. In the background of that, there's 2 other data sets that you hear that weren't part of the original thing. There's one which is solar activity over time. There's a sort of 11-year solar cycle where the sun gets more active and less active. And this is factored into all of the climate models that exist. So researchers are able to take that into account when they are drawing conclusions from that data. But we wanted people to be able to hear that, because in Alaska, you see the northern lights, and the solar cycle is what drives northern lights, the aurora borealis. And so we wanted to get that in to the thing. And so we joined that in. And then we also joined in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time as a sort of siren. And you don't hear it at the start of the track, because the atmosphere is in a more or less normal place. But then by the end of it, this siren is like really loud, and it's going and it really takes over the track and becomes very, very prominent. And that's kind of part of the storytelling of that particular sonification. So what we're doing is, we'll have our kind of like core story data set, and then we will constantly be trying other things, alongside that data and seeing if it works. And sometimes things don't work because, I don't know, maybe it isn't particularly meaningful. It doesn't change enough, or maybe it doesn't work because there aren't enough data points. That happens sometimes, quite often. If you are doing let's say we were making a sonification that was 365 seconds long, and every second you get a new data point from your main data source. And then maybe you want to overlay on top of that monthly data. And that would mean that, you only have like 12 data points over the course of this 300-second long song, or 360-second long song. And so it doesn't change very often. And so it's just like, continuously for 12 seconds. And you're like, what am I supposed to be hearing from this? So,
I mean, maybe
we do think about musical shape and how fast we want specific things to change, and how slowly we want specific things to change.
But that kind of reminded me, because like the one in Alaska, I think this was your first episode, right? As I remember. But what I found like most interesting in that was that, it's the data set is like it takes a story that's almost that's charming in a way. It's like this. I can imagine these people just go, no, yeah, let's just take bets when the ice is going to break, and something like that. So it's like this whole playful community behind it, but behind that there's a darker message, which obviously kind of just comes knocking at the door. And I think like with you putting in the
siren,
the siren sound and something like that, it was almost like the knocking is just getting louder and louder, or
getting louder until you can't ignore it.
Yeah, it's just juxtaposing, and that I found like brilliant, is just finding these ways of you present one story, but there's like a little message there. Well, not little, but, yeah.
I think there are very few people on the planet at this point who don't know about climate change and what's happening. Whatever they think about it, they don't know that this is a thing that a lot of people are concerned about. And one of the things that we are constantly having difficulty with is just fatigue. You were talking earlier about how constantly on the news you just see endless reports about how the world is a terrible place and getting worse. And with that one, we wanted to tell a different story. And as soon as I saw that data set, I was like, this is brilliant. That was like when I pitched Miriam the idea of starting the podcast in the first place, I had that data set in mind already. I was like, this is going to make an amazing piece. And it was the first one that we worked on. But interestingly, the first version of that piece was an absolute mess.
In what way?
We tried to put too much into it. We had, I was talking earlier about how we have kind of three things in there. We have the solar cycles, we have carbon dioxide, and we have the ice breaking up. When we originally started to do it, we had 7 or 8 different data layers in there. And it was just like so much happening at the same time that you couldn't pick any one thing out. It was like a 6 or 7 minute version of one of those tiny compressed experience of drinking beer things, with it changing constantly. And so we listened to it and we were like, this just isn't working. We need to strip this like way back, focus on the absolute core of that story. And I think that the final piece was so much stronger as a result. And it's interesting, like when I started making the podcast, it had been quite a long time since I'd made really much music of my own. But I've learned so much from doing the sonification work that I now apply to my own music. And that is one of them. Don't have 20 different things that are going on all at the same time. Have 3 and be subtle with some and bring them like into the foreground at different points. And it's just these are all things that, people who are watching who make music will absolutely know. But people who are watching who maybe don't make music of their own might not appreciate this. So yeah, next time you're listening to a piece of music, try and sort of pick out like what is being foregrounded here and what's in the background. And then does that stay the same throughout the whole track? And
the art of mixing
really
and arrangement. Yeah.
Right, exactly. There's so much, and when you've got data that is saying you don't get to choose, this is what actually happened. But that's when it becomes interesting.
Yeah, but looking at data, right? Because mapping is one of the strategies when it comes to data sonification, right? It's just like okay, let me map this set of numbers to this parameter and stuff like that. So, can you tell me a bit about this process? Like, since now going through a bit of episodes, you probably became accustomed to what would work, what shall not. And like, can you tell me a bit about the process when it comes to mapping certain parameters? Let's say, what do you look out for? How do you engage with the story in this way when you start like mapping the parameters?
Yeah, I mean, different musical parameters give very different impressions. Some of them people are very sensitive to. Pitch is a great example. You can hear 2 things that are like ever so slightly not the same pitch, or people who don't have pitch deafness can do that. And so as a result, if there's a tiny change, you will hear it. Whereas if you were mapping the exact same numbers to, I don't know, reverb, let's say, depth of reverb on a mix, you wouldn't hear that tiny change at all. And so there are some things that are useful to be able to foreground, and that's when you will pick something like pitch, or filter cutoff is another really good example. It's really easy to hear when a filter is being opened up just a tiny bit. But yeah, distortion, like most effects, it's much more difficult. Volume is actually quite difficult, but then sometimes they will have a much greater impact when you go from very low numbers to very high numbers. So, reverb is a great example of that. Volume is a great example of that. Distortion is a great example of that. Whereas with pitch, if something goes from very, very low to very, very high, you hear it, but it maybe doesn't have... I suppose it can have an emotional effect on you, but it's a different emotional effect.
But do you look at like mapping different parameters so that each parameter can also have like the depth to a story? So let's say, for example, I don't know, pitching a filter to signify changes in, I don't know, like dampness or whatever, so something that would correlate to our understanding of what's happening. Or let's say
I can give you a filter example if you want.
Yeah,
so
sure.
so there was a piece I did called London Under the Microscope, and this was for the Museum of London, in collaboration with a fantastic visual designer called Valentina De Filippo. And they wanted to get a sonification of London's experiences during the first year of COVID. And so what I used for that is I used a saw wave, so like this very harsh sound, but I had it filtered down a lot. And so it sounded very, very smooth. And then I mapped the cutoff of that filter to the case rate and the death rate. So when cases and deaths rise, it sort of goes from again. And you really get this like emotional vibe that like things have suddenly got very here. But then it goes down again, you're like, ooh, okay, that's over. You really feel something from that. So yeah, having these techniques that you can reach for, like different things in your toolbox, is really, really helpful.
I mean, for any listener or viewer, please do go check out the COVID piece. Because like I remember this was the first thing that I actually heard from you apart from the script.
Oh wow, okay.
Was like this, like I went a bit hunting even before I went into loud numbers and stuff like that. And when I saw this piece, especially also with the visuals and everything like that, and like it just threw me back into the hellhole that was COVID, and especially in the UK, which was quite harsh, obviously, as it was everywhere. But like I remember there was this one sound that you have used there that I don't know why, but it felt heavy, and I don't know, maybe because it was the message or something like that. But I think there was like this, it wasn't like a coin toss or something like that, but it was like this little bell sound, or like a muffled,
these sort of ping.
Yeah. And I remember just listening to that and being like, why is this so ominous? Like this little bell sound, which again, by virtually just listening to that, the concept there, the overall message is just like kind of empowered it with so much more emotion, now that we have like this thing behind it.
I mean, this is where knowing a bit about how harmony works, which like I don't know that much about how harmony works. Like I'm not like pro in my music theory or anything, but knowing just a little bit allows you to really dial in some of those emotional things. Like if you start thinking about different modes, each of those has a kind of interesting, like whether they are more major or more minor or something in between, they have very different connotations for how it feels when you listen to it. There was I can't remember the chord that I ended up using on that, but it was like a 13th chord or something like that, and I was just sort of like pulling notes out from that chord and using them for different things. So each variant of COVID had a different note associated with it, and it would fade in and fade out, and so the chord would shift in its position at different times depending on the that's like a kind of subtlety to the piece that I didn't like explain before people hear it, but it's just a nice little extra detail that when you get to talk about it you can say, and I think that worked amazing. really well.
I mean like even because it's so interesting, like especially because you mentioned like harmony and how obviously this is like one of the best ways of creating not creating emotion, but like emphasizing emotion through use of
drawing that emotion out.
But also like I found it interesting, especially like I think we talked a bit about this over the lines messaging, but like there was you made a script that was called Pulse, was it PPM? So
PPM, let's talk about some of the script.
Well, PPM, which stands for is it part per meter or something like that?
Parts per million.
Parts per million. Even far worse. But I remember like I was presenting the script on the talkie show, and I remember just like talking about this thing, right? The overall messaging that went into something that, it has a very simple graphical user interface. It doesn't do much, but like talking the message and like listening to my headphones as I was making the episode, I was like, I was thinking to myself, man, this sounds really ominous. Like, and it's not harmony; it's just a pure tone. And this is
it's a sine wave. That's
it's a sine wave, yeah. And it's just like it just kind of made me feel like, oh, you can add so much if you just contextualize it. Like having any note, any drum, anything like that. If you can contextualize it in a way, you can get across the message like far more in your face, I think. And this is again something that we talked about. So what was the idea behind that? Like, because it's such a simple thing. What drove you to creating probably the simplest Norse script there is?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the simplest for sure. I mean, I think that script is kind of emblematic of an approach that I sort of take. I'm really, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners as well and viewers will be really, really interested in generative sequencing, right? Where you are basically using random numbers to compose with, right?
Yeah.
What I love about sonification is it's like flavored random numbers. They're not random. They've got a story and they're coming with it. And it's your job to use your sound design techniques to tell that story in the best way you can. So instead of just like, rolling some dice, let the atmosphere or, the ecosystem or people in a population in a place, let them roll those dice with, I don't know, support for some policy over time, or you can pick almost anything. We're swimming in data at this point, and you'll have tons of data that you have access to just about yourself. It might be like your mobile phone probably has like a step counter on it. You can sonify that. You can sonify all kinds of like personal stuff, and being able to use that data in place of random numbers, I think can instantly generate so much of the emotion that a lot of generative music really lacks.
Yeah. I mean, because when we listen to generative music, it's one of my favorite things to do. It's just basically, it's
me too. Yeah.
Because firstly, it's simple to make, and secondly, you focus far more on the emotional backdrop of what sound is making, how it's making it, and whatever, So of course, but at times it just becomes pale.
Right.
Especially if you go to YouTube and just like, I don't know, search ambient mix, and then you're gonna generate a 1 hour generative modular ambient mix, and it's just like,
right.
Yeah, it's great. I put it on
it's nice to put it on in the background.
Yeah, but at the same time
you don't feel much.
Yeah. But now when you especially because you stated like, oh, you're spicing up the not randomness, but you're spicing up the perceived randomness that may come, because you're putting real life numbers or real events meaning, basically. So this is like because we talked about the Norn script, there was like this one script that was it called Loud Numbers or So there's a script that is called Loud Numbers. I've got a habit of calling everything Loud Numbers, partly because I think it's a really great name. It's a catchy, it's a catchy name.
I'm not bragging. I can't claim any credit for that one. But also because, it's useful to kind of have that brand out there, I guess. But okay. So the Loud Numbers script it's more of a tool than an art piece in its own right. So the piece that we were talking about before, ppm, this is a single sine wave that reflects the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If you've got your Norns connected to the internet, then when you start up the script, it will reach out to a server on the internet. The server will come back and it will tell it here's how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere today. And then it will play a sine wave that represents that. And it goes from, I can't remember offhand what the scale is, but it's something like a sort of C2 to a C4 or something like that. And when we reach C4, that'll be at the point at which, serious bad stuff starts happening in the
it's only a perfect fifth away, as I remember it, because I was tuning it and I saw, oh wait, it's somewhere around F3 now. Yeah, and it's only a fifth, and that's the crazy part.
Yeah. And I think I was when I wrote the description of it, I sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek said there are no controls. If you want to change the frequency, you need to vote for politicians who support strong climate action, or something like that.
Oh man.
So it's there's a certain bit of silliness going on there as well. But of course, it is a super serious subject.
Of course,
it is. Climate change is the kind of cause that I have dedicated most of my life's work to. So I'm I know that it isn't something that you should joke about, but I think that it can help to joke about these things when they feel
because
grim sometimes.
Because it moves the message, right? It moves the message.
Yeah. And quite a lot of my work is about getting people to talk about climate change in contexts where they might not talk about climate change normally. So, for example, or just to think about it. So, for example, when you're choosing what script to put on your Norns, you might be like, oh yeah, climate change is a thing. And maybe some people want that and maybe some people don't. But yeah, I think it's useful. I think that's probably the way to look at it. But anyway, you were asking about loud numbers. Loud numbers is more of a tool. This allows anyone to import a CSV file. A CSV is a kind of data file. Google Sheets can export it. Excel can export CSVs. So if you've got numbers in a spreadsheet like that and they're in nice, well-organized columns, then you can export a CSV, import it into the script, and it will, by default, spit out a bunch of pitches that are reflective of that data. So lower numbers will be lower pitches and higher numbers will be higher pitches. You can choose a root note, you can choose a BPM that it'll play out at, and you can choose to quantize it to a scale as well. So that kind of lets you have some of that emotional thing. You might want to have it on minor pentatonic if it's sad data.
It's
or
basically
whatever.
It's basically the same way when we do generative music. We set the scales. Well, at times we can set the scales, the root note, the sound, and everything like that. And what I found really cool about it is obviously that you have MIDI connectivity, meaning that just hook it up to your DAW and use whatever sound you want, or
you can do that. And it also will send out MIDI CC as well. So if you want to not necessarily get pitch sonification out of it, but you want to control maybe the volume of a chord over time or something like that, it can do that as well. And it connects up as well with Crow, so you can bring that into the Eurorack world. And I think that's it. I don't think I ever put I2C functionality in it, but yeah, maybe that's coming in a future update.
The update, yeah. But how did you start with making your own scripts when it comes to Norn stuff?
Yeah, so how did I start? I think I found out about Norns after I got into modular, like everybody else, at the start of the pandemic. I got into all the modular stuff, and then I heard about Norns and I discovered the lines for them, and I was like, oh my God, this place is wonderful. This place feels like home. It's like that. That's why I love Lines, because it feels like home. It's full of amazing people doing amazing things.
It's probably
in a supportive environment.
It's probably the most supportive synth environment I ever been to when it comes to that.
Is.
It has a great or yeah,
just the vibe is right.
Yeah, but what I really like about it is like the lack of assholes that just know better, and I love that you can basically ask anything, and you get supportive answers either way, and just like interesting topics that you can just throw around and bounce off of people, of course.
So I discovered this community, and I discovered the hardware, and I looked at Norns, and I was like, "Ooh, that's expensive." And at that point, they were still selling the Norns Shield, and I was like, "Oh, that's a bit less expensive. I can probably afford that." So I ordered a Norns Shield, and it arrived. And from the start, I was kind of interested in coding with it. I have never sort of studied coding or anything like that, but I have messed around with it quite a bit and made kind of like weird arty stuff with it. For a while, I was very into pen plotters and making generative artworks with a kind of like a robot arm with a pen on the end, essentially. And then that kind of got consumed by the whole world of NFTs, and I was like, I don't want to go anywhere near that. And
never go into
that's
NFTs.
That's the point at which I kind of got into the generative music side of things instead. So I'd always been interested in creative coding, and it seemed like a really nice platform to do that would work with my Eurorack and with other MIDI devices that I had. And so I'd never written any Lua before. Lua is the language that you write Norn scripts with. I'd never written any Lua before, but I worked my way through the Norn studies, and I was like, this is very straightforward. It works exactly how I want it to. I was able to get some good results pretty quickly. And there was a great community of people who were able to help me when I ran into trouble. And so, I started making the loud number script. I think it was the first script that I made.
The loud numbers was the first, yeah.
Loud numbers was the first one, yeah. And I've updated it a bunch since, but yeah. And since then, I've done a couple of others. There's PPM, which you talked about. There is one called, it's not sonification, but it's called Grid of Points. And it turns the grid into essentially a quantized keyboard. And on one axis, you have going up in pitch. And on the other axis, you have timbre. And so it will send out CC values based on how high on the grid you press. But if you just use the internal built-in engine, it will crossfade between a triangle wave and a square wave. So it's sort of like very soft sounds at the bottom, harsher sounds at the top. And so you can kind of play on it like that, and you never press any wrong notes because it's quantized.
Of course. You also did UFO, as I remember, right?
UFO. Yeah. So this was a collaboration with Jason.
Jonathan.
Jonathan Snyder.
Yeah.
Jay Snyder. Yeah, exactly. And he composed. Well, so I had this idea that I wanted to have a drone that was modulated by the position of the International Space Station over the Earth at any time. So the International Space Station orbits the Earth once every 90 minutes or so. And so if you track its longitude from 0 to 360 degrees, you get what is essentially a 90-minute saw wave. It goes up, 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 and then it crosses the international date line and it goes down to 0 again. And it goes up, 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 up. And you can do the same thing with latitude, but with latitude, it traces out a sine wave instead because of the way orbits work. And so you get a 90-minute sine wave off that. And I just thought, I was familiar with the Sloth module from I think it's Nonlinear Circuits, Australian Eurorack manufacturer.
What's a Sloth module?
So this is a module that it basically creates very chaotic modulation, but that is really, really slow. Like you can have it that sort of like it does its modulation over a period of a few minutes, or there's a version that does it over like tens of minutes, and there's a version that does it over like tens of hours or something like that. Vastly long periods of time.
Okay.
And so it moves, but it moves very slowly. And I was kind of inspired by that, but I wanted to pull something from the real world. And I was like, the International Space Station is a really interesting example. So again, when you turn the script on, and you're connected to the internet, it will grab from a server the position of the International Space Station, and then it maps that position, the longitude, the latitude, and if you put your own longitude and latitude into the script itself, it will also map a third parameter, which is the distance of the ISS to you at any one point. And you can get those just as voltages out through Crow, but it also comes with a drone on board, a Supersaw drone that Jonathan composed, and it sort of modulates that drone essentially, and it's this beautiful, like, spacey, sort of retro futuristic, like space race nostalgia kind of feelings sound, and I absolutely love it. He did a wonderful job on the drone.
Did you collaborate with Jonathan when it come, like, did he make this saw sync beforehand, and was it already in the hub, or like how did you collaborate?
So originally I wanted to do it myself. I wanted to do the drone myself. And I've learned bits and pieces of Super Collider, which is what you write sound engines in Norns. Norns uses Lua for the sort of basic scripting and the interface and sequencing, but then it uses Super Collider for like sound and digital signal processing and things like that. And I've worked with Super Collider a little bit. I never felt particularly confident with it. And I knew that this was going to hold me up, essentially. I wanted to get the script done, and I knew that if I needed to compose my own drone, I wouldn't be happy with it. It would just take me like a year or something, and I was like, either I collaborate with someone else to do this, or this script is never going to get released. So I reached out to him and I was like, hey, do you want to collaborate on this? And he was like, yeah, absolutely. And so we collaborated on it, and it was really nice. And I think I would love to see more people in the community doing collaborations like this, because I think it's so powerful. Like, there are some people who are really good at one thing, but might not be so good at something else. You know, I'm pretty good at working with data. I'm not so good at working with Super Collider and sound design on Norns. And then there are, other people who have those complementary skill sets. And so I think it's really nice to use those complementary skill sets and get something that both of you are going to be really happy with. I'd love to see more of that happening in the community.
Yeah, I also noticed that there's a lot of this individualistic look when it comes to coding, especially like on Norns and stuff like that. And that's kind of I wouldn't say counterintuitive, but it's kind of interesting that, with people such as people online, which are very into the openness of the community and whatnot, that a lot of them just kind of go into their own minds. And I think maybe that's like just the nature of people when they code. It's just like, they like to be kind of in their own little world, creating this stuff, trying to debug and stuff like that. But with collaborations, especially when it comes to using something for the synth engines and then something of the user interface and stuff like that. So like, let's say for example, me and Sona Circuit are collaborating on this bird script.
Tell the people watching about that, because it's super cool.
I mean, this isn't out yet. There's only the beta version. So I've been doing like 2 scripts of my own now. The first one is this bird delay script, which basically takes, the idea is that it takes different bird calls that bird species make, and then puts those bird calls into how the rates on the soft cut delays are pitched. Meaning that if you, let's say, record something into your Norns, it kind of takes just a little piece of that recording and then just kind of throws it through the wacky soft cut rates that are basically taken from real bird song, just like so.
So you could play a guitar into it, and it would make the guitar sound like birdsong. Is that how it works?
Basically, it creates like a little sample of it. You can use it as a delay. So Sonocirca did a great job of creating a threshold buffer. So whenever that threshold kind of receives, it kind of exceeds the threshold, it would take out new data and just throw it through the bird delay. So through the, sorry about that. Just wait a second.
That's okay.
So just my wife just came. So
no problem.
So, but anyways, you would have like this different bird species, and you would change the bird species. And now, with Sonocircuit help, we also have like a garden mode, which basically you can put. I'm gonna put a blackbird there, a robin there, a starling there, and stuff like that, and it would just like overplay each other with this wacky rates. So the idea was there, but this is where I needed help, because I started as a simple idea, and then this simple idea just like transcended into something that's far more complicated from my understanding of Lua or programming. I never programmed before in my life. It was just like whatever. And then I also have this second one, which is slowly coming to its finish line, and it's called Perception, and basically it's taking the CFF values. You know what CFF is? So,
no, I don't.
Okay, so CFF is like critical flicker fusion frequency. It's basically how we perceive, when we look at light, right? And light is always doing this, but because we have a certain refresh rate, a certain frame rate, we perceive it as a steady source of light. However,
just like you do with sound waves.
Of course. So, but different animals, going by the studies, different animals have different perception in the CFF values. So, let's say a honeybee would have 200, would have a CFF of 200, while we as people, we have like 60. So like, because it's more CFF, basically in layman's terms means more frames per second, therefore it's more in slow motion. So the idea there is just to take this data sets or this type of data and just then throw it into how Softcut acts as in its rate changes. So basically, you can record something in, and then as you turn it, you can either go in higher CFF values, meaning you would hear the slower version, or you would go into lower CFF values, which would just basically mean higher versions. And this would just make this like a little interesting way of how animals might experience sound, because this was. Like, I was looking at Ben Jordan's video on the subject of how animals hear sound and stuff like that, and I was just like, damn it, so my dog hears it far more, far slower than I perceived. So, so if me going like, hey, Pixie, something like that, she would basically hear something like, hey, Pixie, and it's just like gonna freak me out. Like, what the hell?
Yeah.
But like, it's all to do with how they function. And it's just like, it opened up a whole black hole in animal perception, in the bioacoustic spheres and everything like that just made it like very, very interesting. And and
it sounds like it would interface quite interestingly with the birdsong thing as well.
Yeah.
If you played some birdsong into it and then you hear it like a bird would, maybe it sounds
I tried that
intelligible.
Because you do have like a sample playback. You can basically go into your what's it called, like a disk on Norse, and you can choose the file sample. So I tried it so I had like a recording of a dawn chorus and a recording of a beehive, because I really wanted to see, like, is there a way? So, like, with birds, especially starlings, because I don't know if you know a bit about birds, but, like, starlings have these, like, very MIDI-esque sounds. So they sound like a unquantized fast CV into plates, and it just sounds like, you know, it's just like very weird. And it's like, what the hell? And they do have like a CFF number for a starling particularly, because different birds perceive differently as well. So I just put like this bird song into a starling, and you would hear like, if you listen to a starling in slow motion, you hear such intriguing, you know, bird song in those like very, very weird, you know, MIDI-esque sounds that it makes. It's just like this beautiful bird song that it's like in between if you just slow it down. And the same thing with like honeybees, because like honeybees, you will only hear like this, you know, like this buzzing of the thing. But if you put it through the ears of a honeybee, I guess, like, so these a CFF value of 200 plus their frequency range of hearing is around 1 to 500 hertz, so it's like very narrow mid-ranged. You basically, it just, you hear this softness to the buzzing, and it just like this very, very lovely soft waves, and it's just like, you know, this is all speculation, and it's all like simulation and something like that. So, you know, but you know, it kind of makes you feel, it kind of makes you think, wow, is this how like they perceive, how would it be? And then at the same time, you kind of feel like, okay, you know, like a fly, like a little fly, you know, fly sees, let's say from our terms, everything in slow motion. So if you want to catch a fly, here's a pro tip: you just go very, 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 very slowly, and it will not perceive your hand moving because it's moving so slowly.
The same way we don't really perceive clouds moving, but
the same way we don't perceive climate change, you know, because it just like takes time. But like, so at the same time, you're kind of going, okay, so like if we have like a flicker rate of like 60, and you put like a little, like when a fly moves into her house, let's say at night or something like that, she perceived the like a disco ball, like a club setting, because it just like constantly opens with light and closes with light. So, you know,
and they're like, why do they keep turning the lights on and off?
But like it's so weird, like weird. It's a great way of seeing the world, and maybe, you know, like it just makes you think. So again, this is something that, you know, the people at Alliance and all the developers and stuff like that, you know, because I do think you have like two different ways of doing it. Some people make the most amazingly fun scripts, you know, the weird rates, the way how to do it, and some people just go into, it's not, let's say, per se an art piece, but it's like it's something that you think about or you find interesting in the real world, and then you just try to create something out of it. And I think like with data sonification and how you do it and everything like that, it's just like, again, it's real world presented through the bits and pieces that the hardware here, let's say, creates.
And I really think that, you know, in the context of the climate crisis, this is the most useful thing that artists can do. This is something a British poet called Simon Armitage was saying recently, that the way that poets fight climate change is to make us spellbound by nature, make us care about the world around us.
Oh, that's so
that, that's like that is what we can do. You know, that is our job in this situation. I think it's so great that you're doing this work about drawing people's attention to nature and about how amazing it is.
I mean, it's like with everybody that, like, even now, I don't know, like a few months ago, somebody made like a thread online called the acoustic ecology, and I never knew what acoustic ecology is. And then, you know, just looking at it and like reading it, I was like, wow, this sounds so amazing, you know, bioacoustic, stuff like that. So how, you know, animals interact, how we perceived their way of communication. It's just like you start really caring about nature. And it's like the same thing with Armitage. The poet said, you give reason for people that may have forgotten the beauty of the outside world just by drawing attention to it. Like, look at this beauty, look at this, and feel that.
And then if you want to, you can start drawing people's attention to what is happening to that beauty.
Yeah, of course.
Because that, populations of birds are falling.
Of course. And even,
populations of honeybees are falling. Maybe there's like a colony collapse disorder mode that you put into it where it just like the sound goes away over time.
Well, I think that could be a great idea. That could be a great idea for an update. You just have like a combination of keys, and it's just like, oh, we have reached these. Now we're at this perceived year, and there is no honeybee.
Yeah,
or something like that.
Yeah. Sorry, all the bees died. You can't play with the script anymore.
I did have sorry, this is a bit off topic, but I once had an idea, and maybe I'm gonna do it, but I wanted really to make like a Norse, the first Norse shitposting script.
Okay.
So you would have it's gonna be a blank screen, and you put you route your audio through it, and there's like a 5% chance that in half an hour it will be completely destroyed. So meaning that, perfect for live settings, you just put it in and you roll the dice. And if you make it through the half an hour without something happening, great. But there's this chance that it's going to distort, that it's going to create the most outlandish thing. And it's just like...
People love this stuff. It's like tape gear, People love having their signal degraded in interesting ways. And
because I think
there's some really interesting parallels you can draw there to the destruction of nature.
There you go. It's spoken like a true data scientist. Oh man. Okay, I have one last question. I think. Let's say that somebody that's really into sound art, sonification, and stuff like that, and really wants to try his gist at data sonification. How should this person, that might be me, but how should that person get into
asking for a friend?
I'm asking for a friend. This is don't worry about me. But like, how can they get into this? Like, what's the source? If they never did anything like this, of course they can use your scripts because they are pretty open to that. But let's say, for example, if somebody really wants to make like a more gigantic piece, something in the way of Loud Numbers is as a podcast and stuff like that, what would they do? How do they start?
Okay, so I would say two things. Number one is that about a year ago, I set up a small Discord community called Decibels. You can join it at decibels.community. Just type that into your browser and you'll find it. And there's about 200 odd people there. It's not a crazy busy Discord server, but there's lots of people who are just kind of interested in sonification. It's totally okay to join and just lurk. Like, that's totally fine. It's doubly nice if you want to introduce yourself and post things from time to time, but it's cool to lurk. That's thing number one, join Decibels. Thing number two is start really, really small. Like, put your computer to one side, you don't even need like a spreadsheet. Just maybe get a piece of paper and maybe, I don't know, look at the most recent 10 photos that you've got in your camera phone or something, and then write what is depicted in that thing. Maybe it's some food, maybe it's your dog, maybe it's your family or something like that. Put it into like, I don't know, 3 to 5 categories, let's say, and then figure out a sound that you associate with that category, right? And then you just run through the 10 and you make that sound and you've got a sonification. But that is like minimum tech sonification. This is part of a movement that I'm really trying to encourage in the wider sonification community called open sonifications, which is about bringing it away from code, away from sound design and music theory and stuff like that, and just helping people giving people permission to use sound as a way to express how they feel about their personal data. Mm-hmm. And I think once you've done that a few times with a few different things, you will very quickly understand the basics of how you map data. Like I did a workshop with some, it was like a kind of corporate workshop about a year ago. And we had this group and they did this exercise and they went through their calendar for the last week and they wrote down all the meetings and they wrote down, was this a short meeting, a medium length meeting, or a long meeting? And was this meeting useful or was it boring?
Let me guess.
and then they mapped it on and they basically made a sound. If it was a long meeting, they would make a long sound. If it was a short meeting, they make a short sound. And if it was a great meeting, they would like, woo. And so like a short, good meeting would be like, woo. But a long, great meeting would be like, woo, kind of thing. And then if it was a boring meeting, they would yawn. And it would be like, or, and it's just, and like when you listen to them just like run through their week, you can immediately tell, was it a good week of meetings or was it not a good week of meetings? You know, and it's expressive, it's human. You know, we started this whole conversation out talking about human stories and human data. And I think starting out with that kind of approach, with small data, with maximum human expression, then gives you the understanding that you need when you then expand to doing things more programmatically or with sound design, and things like that. Basically, do sketches with your mouth, with instruments around you. You can just kind of like bang on things fast or slow, let them ring out, mute them. There's so many different ways you can just like adjust a simple sound like that like before you start getting into configuring synthesizers and like drawing virtual patches and things like that. So yes, that's what I would say. Join decibels and then start super simple with some open sonifications that you make of your own personal data, things that you feel something about.
You have mentioned open sonification, but there's also punk sonification, as I understand it.
Yeah, so
what's the difference?
Punk sonification, so open sonifications is what evolved out of punk sonification. And the reason we changed it is because, well, it's kind of two things. One is that one of the people that we were collaborating with, he's of Asian origin, South Asian origin, and he grew up in London in the kind of the late 80s. And when he was growing up, punk was sort of associated with a lot of like far right-wing politics, like the skinhead movement and all of this. There was some very, very unpleasant politics involved with it. And he was really, really intimidated by punks. It was not a good association that he has with the term punk. And so we were kind of, and he sort of expressed this to us, and he was like, I don't think I can sign up to be involved in something that's called punk sonification. And so we had a conversation. We were kind of like, well, punk sonification is really just one, what we were calling punk sonification is one expression of something that is actually a much broader thing. Something that is much more about, some of the things I've said, human stories, small data, punk is an approach that you can take to that, but it is not the only approach. And so we tried to zoom out and be more encompassing of lots of different ways in which you can do sonification, express yourself with sound and data, that would be more approachable for the maximum possible audience. And if you go to opensonifications.net, we have kind of published a little manifesto there that basically says sonification is not just one thing, it's a whole diversity of things. We encourage curious approaches to exploring the world through data and sound, and that the act of making a sonification is just as, if not more important than the final outcome. So process is just as important as the outcome.
So for all the listeners and all the viewers, go to opensonification.com, as I understand it.
.net.
.net. Okay.
Yeah. I'm old school when it comes to domains. .com for me means a company. And this is not a company.
Of course. What about if people want to get in touch with you? Where do they find you? How can they find you?
They can find me at duncangeere.com. Duncangeere.com is basically just an index, and like a lot of, I guess, sort of people who do interesting things. I have a ton of different identities. And we've talked about a lot of them on this call. I'm a musician, but I'm also a data storyteller, and I'm also a sonification artist and a climate campaigner and all of these other things. So it's kind of like a list of those things, and then it links out to the various places you can find out more about things. If you want to hear the podcast that we talked about a lot earlier, that's at loudnumbers.net. loudnumbers.net/podcast if you want to go straight there. But if you go to loudnumbers.net, you'll find links to all the other stuff that we've talked about here, more or less, and quite a bit more. Some of the climate pieces that we did for a Swiss jazz trombonist in COP26 in Egypt a couple of years ago.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, various other bits and pieces. And pretty soon there'll be some stuff there from a sonification piece that I've been working on recently about an 1859 solar storm called the Carrington Event. That's like a post-rock sonification, which I did on guitar. And that's a really good example of an open sonification, actually, because it's all about performance and expression through guitar. Like, there is a data level to that, but the data is more providing a score that I then play, in the moment. Then it changes every time I play it. So that's kind of interesting. And lots more projects. We're always spinning a million plates.
Go listen to Loud Numbers podcast. It's brilliant. So
thank you so much,
Duncan. It's been a great pleasure hosting you, and
I've really loved this chat. Thank you for taking the time.
Of course. And we'll see each other online, and everybody just join the community. So
absolutely.
Duncan, have a great one, and see ya.
Thank you so much.